When the war in Europe finally ended, the Allies faced a task without precedent. For the first time in modern history, the central leaders of a defeated regime were to be judged publicly, held responsible not for isolated crimes, but for years of violence committed across multiple fronts and against entire populations. From that decision, the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal was born. But before any defendant could sit before the judges, a preliminary question had to be answered. Were they mentally fit to stand trial? In that context, the name of Douglas Kelly emerged. He was a relatively young officer trained in psychiatry and experienced in the European theater of operations, and the U.S. Army assigned him a dual role: to assess the mental health of the detainees and to help keep them stable until the end of the proceedings. There was a clear pragmatic reason behind this. A psychotic outbreak, a nervous breakdown, or a wave of suicides could jeopardize the legitimacy of the trials. The Nuremberg prison, run by Colonel Burton Andrus, became Kelly's working laboratory. Along a single corridor, in numbered cells, were concentrated some of the most feared figures of the 20th century: Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Rosenberg, and others. Each carried a personal history, a military or political rank, and a list of accusations ranging from conspiracy to genocide. Kelly had to see these men one by one. Officially, the mission was defined in legal terms. He had to determine whether the defendants understood the nature of the charges, whether they could cooperate with their lawyers, and whether they could distinguish, in basic terms, right from wrong. If a prisoner presented severe psychotic symptoms, uncontrollable delusions, or extreme cognitive deterioration, then their capacity to stand trial could be questioned. The tribunal needed reports that were clear, direct, and unambiguous, but from the beginning, Kelly felt the story was larger than the task. He was not facing voluntary patients admitted to a hospital, but individuals directly responsible for a machinery of mass destruction. The professional question, is he competent to stand trial, merged in his mind with a broader one. What makes a person order and justify crimes of such magnitude? The medical assignment almost inevitably turned into a unique psychological experiment. The prison environment reinforced that feeling. The cells were small, constantly lit, and monitored day and night. Guards were required to record any strange gesture, any unusual comment, anything that hinted at suicidal intent. This was not theoretical. Some Nazi detainees had already taken their own lives before the trials, and the Allies wanted to prevent that from happening again. Every jar, every rope, every potentially dangerous object was controlled. Amid that rigid environment, Kelly moved with relative freedom. He had daily access to the cells, could converse with prisoners, observe them in moments of calm and tension, and watch how they responded to outside news or tribunal decisions. Very quickly he realized it was not enough to administer a few tests and sign a report. If he wanted to understand the men in front of him, he needed time, repetition, and the ability to measure not only what they said, but how they said it. At first, Kelly expected to find a clear pattern of mental illness, not necessarily in all of them, but in the ringleaders. Delusions of grandeur, approaching psychosis, disconnection from reality, some disorder that could explain what they had done. It seemed almost impossible to him that such extreme decisions could come from ordinary minds. That initial prejudice, shared by much of the public, gave his mission an almost hopeful tint. If the Nazi leaders turned out to be mad, perhaps the world could reassure itself that what happened was a one-time anomaly. But as the days passed, his focus shifted from the search for striking symptoms to something more subtle: personality structure, the way of reasoning, and the moral justifications the prisoners used to explain their roles in the regime. The work ceased to be a simple medical filter and became a psychological interrogation running parallel to the judicial process, in which Kelly became judge, observer, and in some ways the only audience. In that setting, Hermann Göring began to stand out immediately, not only because of his rank, but because of the way he took control of any space he entered. Kelly understood quickly that his mission would not be routine. Evaluating Göring would become the centerpiece of his work in Nuremberg and the key to the question that had haunted him since his arrival. If Göring was not insane, then what exactly was he? When Kelly began his rounds along the Nuremberg corridor, he quickly identified who functioned as the invisible axis of that small universe. There was no need to read the file first. A few minutes of observation made it clear that even defeated, without a uniform and behind bars, Göring still behaved like a man accustomed to giving orders. Other defendants glanced toward his door, waited for his comments, and measured their words according to the reaction of the former Reich Marshal. At first sight, Göring drew attention through physical presence alone. He had lost weight since capture as part of a controlled detox from morphine addiction, yet he retained an imposing build, upright posture, and a way of occupying space that commanded respect even within a cell. When he sat before Kelly, he did not behave like an insecure patient, but like someone used to managing matters of state. From the first interviews, Kelly noticed Göring's talent for taking over a situation. He would stand when an officer entered, greet with calculated courtesy, make a joke or witty remark to reshape the atmosphere, and within seconds it seemed as if he were receiving visitors rather than being evaluated. In conversation, he answered questions with ease, often expanding beyond them and redirecting the focus toward topics that favored him. He showed no obvious anxiety, no explicit fear, no signs of confusion. In the exercise yard, his leadership was even more evident. The other prisoners naturally grouped around him, some seeking approval, some symbolic protection, or simply company. Göring distributed sarcasm, political observations, and recollections from his time in power with a mix of nostalgia and arrogance. The informal hierarchy of the prison reproduced on a smaller scale the power structure of the former regime, and Göring remained at the top. Kelly observed this with clinical curiosity. In hospitals, authority belongs to the doctor, and it was disconcerting to face someone who still claimed control of the scene, even as a prisoner. Instead of a man broken by defeat, Kelly saw an individual who continued using charisma as a tool of dominance. That ability to organize the social environment around him became one of the keys to understanding the character. In one-on-one interviews, Göring displayed skill in presenting himself as a historical figure. He enjoyed recounting episodes from his past, his time as a flying ace in the First World War, his role in the early Nazi years, his rapid rise in the Third Reich. He narrated political battles, internal intrigues, and high-level decisions, always placing himself at the center of the stage. Kelly noted that even when Göring admitted mistakes, he did so in a way that reinforced his image of strong, indispensable, almost tragic. What drew attention was not only the content, but the tone. Göring spoke clearly, with well-constructed sentences, using humor when it suited him and dramatic emphasis when it served him. He could shift from arrogance to victimhood in seconds if he sensed it might generate empathy. He never lost awareness of the effect his words had. This was not theoretical delusion. It was calculated performance from someone who knew he still had an audience. Kelly noticed how Göring managed information inside the prison. He presented himself to other detainees as an expert on the Allied judicial system, someone who understood the Americans and could predict what they should expect. Sometimes he downplayed the danger. Other times he acted defiantly, insisting that history would judge them differently. This mix of confidence and defiance strengthened his leadership. In private, another facet appeared.
At times, Göring acknowledged the war was lost, The Reich had collapsed, and he likely would not leave Nuremberg alive. Yet even then, his main concern seemed to be how he would be remembered. He returned repeatedly to posterity, history books, and the image that would remain of him. The fear was less about death than irrelevance. For Kelly, that detail was crucial. A man obsessed with legacy is always performing, even in a cell. Every gesture and every response becomes part of the image he wants to build. Kelly realized that in front of Göring, he was not simply speaking to a defendant, but confronting an actor who understood observation and used it to maintain control. Their relationship grew nuanced. Göring seemed to enjoy the intellectual game of interviews, sometimes trying to reverse roles by asking Kelly questions about American politics, the morality of Allied bombings, or Germany's future. The purpose was double: to humanize himself to the doctor and to test him, gauge his reactions, and measure how far he could influence him. Kelly tried to maintain professional distance, but he could not deny the subject was fascinating. The contrast between the crime file and the man in the cell was stark. He did not see a broken, incoherent, or delusional figure, but someone who maintained remarkable control over himself and others, even at the worst moment of his life. That dissonance between the scale of the crimes and the apparent normality of behavior sank into Kelly, and he began to suspect his work in Nuremberg would lead to a conclusion nobody wanted to hear. Impressions formed in corridors were not enough. Kelly wanted data. Coming from an academic environment shaped by psychological testing and influenced by his work around the Rorschach tradition, he believed the mind could be described through systematic procedures. Nuremberg offered a unique and terrifying laboratory. 22 leaders of a criminal regime concentrated in one place, willing or not to be examined. Kelly prepared a battery of evaluations. First, full medical examination, physical condition, illness history, war injuries, and substance use, because organic alteration could influence behavior or mimic mental disorder. Next, prolonged clinical interviews, where he not only asked direct questions, but observed speech coherence, lapses, silences, and emotional control. Finally came the most innovative tools of the time, intelligence tests and projective tests, especially the Rorschach plates, those symmetrical ink blots designed to reveal how a subject organizes ambiguous reality. With Göring, Kelly applied the complete package. He began with intelligence testing, and Göring participated with visible enthusiasm. For a man obsessed with hierarchy, any ranking was an opportunity. Facing vocabulary, reasoning, and comprehension problems, he responded quickly, often with a small smile of satisfaction, as if the entire task amused him. The result was striking. Kelly recorded an IQ of 138, one of the highest among the defendants. Göring seemed unsurprised, and the number reinforced his self-image. Clinically, it ruled out easy explanations. It was difficult to argue that building a repressive apparatus had been the product of confusion. For Kelly, Göring's intelligence made his criminal history even more disturbing. Then came the Rorschach. The goal was less measurement than observation, how Göring structured meaning under ambiguity. For each blot, he described what he saw and why. Göring approached it with curiosity and theatrical confidence, handling each plate carefully, rotating it, commenting aloud as if playing a parlor game. His responses were structured. He did not wander into incoherent associations. He described human figures, animals, action scenes, often with movement, combat, strength. There were no hallucinations, no breakdowns in perception. For Kelly, that was key. The test did not reveal psychosis, but a mind organizing even neutral images through categories of power and struggle. In parallel, Kelly asked prisoners to write autobiographies. Göring wrote at length. In those pages, Kelly found the written form of the same self-centered narrative: courage,
rise, sacrifice for Germany, failures attributed to others, harsh decisions justified as inevitable. Kelly did not work alone. Gustav Gilbert, a U.S. Army psychologist and social psychologist, collaborated closely, administering tests and translating when needed. They shared protocols but differed in emphasis. Kelly focused on cognitive structure and absence of disorganization, while Gilbert emphasized moral atmosphere and ideological content, a difference that would grow. When all information was assembled, Göring's profile was consistent. There was no evidence of hallucinations, delusions, major memory loss, severe confusion, dementia, or organic brain disorder. Thought was organized, attention sustained, orientation intact. Humor and irony were calculated, not unstable outbursts. What emerged strongly was extreme egocentrism. Across conversation, tests, and writing, Göring placed himself at the center of everything: Germany, the war, political decisions, even the meaning of the trials. The intelligence tests showed capability. The Rorschach revealed imagination steeped in action and dominance, and the autobiography confirmed heroic self-myth. Together, they suggested an authoritarian, narcissistic personality rather than psychotic collapse. Kelly also considered addiction. Göring had been captured with a large supply of paracodeine and depended on it for years. Under supervision, he lost weight and reduced use, but Kelly suspected he was seeing less a devastating addiction and more a habit embedded in luxury and entitlement, a ritual compatible with a man demanding control over every aspect of life. Comparing results across defendants, Kelly saw variation but no clinical abyss. Most were functional men capable of logical conversation, understanding their legal situation, and recalling the past. Only isolated cases such as Robert Ley showed deterioration severe enough for genuine mental illness. That finding struck Kelly deeply. He had arrived expecting psychiatric explanation that would separate them from humanity, but the tests returned something else. Highly capable, emotionally shallow, self-centered men, power-focused, but not mad in the way many wanted. Psychology did not provide an alibi. It produced a more unsettling idea. As the results came in and Göring's image solidified, Kelly began to sense the conclusion he would be forced to reach. The problem was not exotic pathology, but common traits: ambition, egocentrism, and devotion to a cause, placed in service of a criminal political project and protected by a massive apparatus of power. The tests did not reassure him. They suggested that under certain circumstances, similar personalities could emerge in any country at any time.
In the Nuremberg prison, the bars, the lights left burning all night, and the constant surveillance were designed to reduce the former Nazi elite to mere cell numbers. But beneath that disciplined surface, the same invisible forces that had structured power in the Third Reich continued to operate: hierarchy, loyalties, resentments, and above all, charisma. Göring, even in prisoner's uniform, remained a specialist in this form of dominance. Kelly noticed it early. During exercise time or brief moments when doors opened, it became obvious that the natural order of the group was shaped not by rules, but by Göring's influence. When he spoke, the others quieted. When he joked, smiles spread down the corridor, sometimes nervous, sometimes admiring. Even those who disliked him could not ignore that he was still organizing the atmosphere. Kelly understood that this charisma was not a superficial trait, but a central component of Göring's psychological structure. It wasn't simply being likable, it was an instinctive ability to take control of social space. At the interrogation table, Göring would settle into his chair, study his interlocutor, judge character within minutes, and adjust behavior to match. With American guards, he adopted a friendly military tone, soldier to soldier. With higher-ranking officers, he grew solemn, emphasizing rank and experience. With psychologists, he became intellectual, ready to debate theories.
This constant adjustment was not instability, it was calculation. Göring understood that anyone entering his cell could become a mediator to the outside world, a guard who shared stories, a doctor writing reports, a chaplain describing mood. That was why he worked to win them over in different ways, and why he rarely missed a chance to impress. Kelly watched it like an actor shifting registers to suit an audience without ever losing control of the stage. The same pattern appeared in formal interviews. When Kelly asked structured questions to test memory, judgment, and abstract thought, Göring answered precisely but added flourishes, turning each response into a small scene. Sometimes he anticipated the next question. Other times he redirected the conversation toward topics favorable to him, forcing Kelly to regain control. The unsettling part was how easily this theatricality could become appealing even to critical observers. There were moments when Göring's humor, friendliness, and apparent sincerity created closeness. Psychologists recognized the pattern, the ability to build a superficial but effective bond without real empathy behind it. Clinically, these were described as affable psychopathic traits. In everyday terms, someone who charms and wins people over without them understanding why. Kelly came to see charisma as a weapon. It didn't fire bullets or command divisions, but it could disarm rational defenses, dilute the sense of danger, and shift an interview from objective analysis to a conversation between equals. Kelly forced himself to maintain distance. After each session, he recorded not only Göring's words, but how Göring made him feel, what impressions he produced, what temptation toward fascination existed. He knew fascination could become blindness. Göring's influence was not limited to professionals. Among prisoners, his behavior fostered a political microcosm. Some respected him as an old leader from the years of triumph. Others blamed him for disastrous decisions. Others sought symbolic protection against the uncertainty of trial. Göring played all roles. Sometimes he acted as leader, giving opinions on defense strategies, lawyers, and judges. Other times he played the dignified victim, insisting history would absolve him and condemn his enemies. This mixture recreated the same logic he had used in power: project certainty, offer protection, demand loyalty. In Nuremberg, Göring's power of action was minimal, but his charisma functioned as a reminder of how millions had once been mobilized under a criminal project. Kelly saw that magnetism in confinement like a mechanism under magnification, the same force once operating at national scale. He also noticed Göring shaping an image for posterity even inside prison limits. He knew psychologists took notes, journalists watched the trial, books would be written about those months. Accordingly, he chose words carefully, offered grand statements, and framed himself as a defeated but coherent statesman, not a broken criminal. That impulse to control narrative was another form of charisma, aimed not only at those present, but at a future audience. And this created a paradox. The qualities that had made Göring central in the regime made him dangerous to the judicial process. A defendant who spoke brilliantly, ridiculed the prosecution, and framed crimes as rational necessity could become a focus of ambiguity in public perception, even if judges could not be convinced. Kelly began to realize his work had another dimension beyond competence. His reports would counter that charisma. If he documented that Göring understood what he had done and why he was being tried, then brilliance and charm could not serve as excuse. The charm was exposed as a tool of power, not a sign of moral health. Over time, Kelly concluded that Göring's most dangerous quality was not mere brutality or fanaticism, but his ability to make brutality seem acceptable, even attractive to those drawn in. Charisma, in his case, was not neutral. It was symbolic violence. And in Nuremberg's silent corridors, Kelly watched it operating daily as a disturbing echo of a dominance once exerted over an entire country.
Yet Kelly was not the only psychologist taking notes. In the Nuremberg cell block, there were two.
Douglas Kelly was not alone in speaking with defendants, observing them, and recording their responses. Nearby worked Gustav Gilbert, a U.S. Army psychologist of Jewish descent, raised in America, fluent in German, assigned not only to evaluate mental states, but to act as translator and observer of the prison's psychological climate. Gilbert spent long hours in cells, listening to detainees justify actions, argue among themselves, or break down. Unlike Kelly, who approached from medical psychiatry, Gilbert leaned towards social psychology, focused on ideology, group dynamics, and moral emptiness. At first, they collaborated closely. They shared offices, impressions, test protocols, and results, including intelligence tests and Rorschach assessments. They agreed on one basic point. These men were morally corrupt and responsible for mass crimes. But when translating that into clinical language, they diverged. For Kelly, the central question remained narrow. Were defendants psychotic, delusional, hallucinating, disorganized, or unable to understand trial reality? His framework separated severe mental illness from personality traits. He recognized cruelty and narcissism, but did not equate them with psychiatric insanity that would remove responsibility. Gilbert saw something darker. It was not enough to say they were technically sane. In Göring, Gilbert saw superficial charm, lack of empathy, manipulation, and easy justification of violence, which he later described as aggressive psychopathy, a personality structure where moral conscience was absent at the core. This contrast emerged clearly in descriptions of Göring. Kelly saw an extremely intelligent man, deeply egocentric, skilled in leadership, capable of emotional control when it suited him, clinically normal in the sense of no break with reality. Gilbert emphasized the darker reading, describing him as an affable psychopath, charming and entertaining, while fundamentally lacking empathy and willing to do anything to keep power. Their differences became concrete after interviews. Kelly might note once again Göring's clear logical mind and ability to understand moral frameworks, even as he justified crimes. Gilbert, reading the same material, saw cold rationalization so severe it indicated profound deviation of personality. Arguments followed. Gilbert feared Kelly risked being seduced by Göring's charisma and mistaking brilliance for moral normality. Kelly feared Gilbert was projecting society's need to imagine monsters separated from ordinary humanity. The dispute became especially focused on the Rorschach. Kelly insisted Göring's responses showed structured perception and organized thinking, no psychosis, only themes of power fitting his history. Gilbert saw dominance, aggressiveness, lack of warmth, and enough evidence of severely deviant personality. Over time, this conflict became emblematic beyond them. Historians and psychologists later debated the same question. Some supported Gilbert's harsher view that the defendants were psychopaths. Others supported Kelly's thesis that the most disturbing element was not clinical monstrosity, but the capacity of functional men to participate in mass crime when power and legitimacy protected them. Gilbert's diary-style memoir reached the public quickly, and the shocked world found comfort in the idea of sickness and exceptional evil. Kelly wrote more analytically, insisting that except in specific cases, he did not find madmen, but dangerously normal men. His message was harder to accept and had less immediate impact. At the center remained Göring. For Gilbert, charisma and seduction were part of psychopathic structure. For Kelly, those same traits proved the opposite of madness. They showed a man who understood social rules and exploited them. Evil could present itself with logic and a smile. After months of testing and observation, Kelly faced the task he had been postponing, putting his verdict in writing. The tribunal did not ask for philosophy, but for a direct answer. Were these men, and especially Göring, mentally capable of being tried and convicted? By then, Kelly's answer rested on rigorous data. In Göring, there was no trace of psychosis, no persistent delusions, no imaginary voices, no severe confusion about time, place, or people. Memory was precise, thought logical, concentration strong. Asked about charges, Göring understood their scope and could describe Nazi state structure, explain decisions, and anticipate legal consequences. Clinically, he was competent. In his Rorschach notes, Kelly used an expression that would later become famous, a basically normal personality. He did not mean kind or balanced. He meant no fractures of madness, coherent perception, structured associations, intact reality testing. What stood out was egocentrism and emotional energy directed toward dominance and command. Later, Kelly summarized his conclusion. The main Nazis were neither unique demons nor exotic psychological anomalies, but men with familiar traits, thirst for power, opportunism, and lack of moral restraint when ideology and system offered cover. Their profile was not rare. What made them catastrophic was historical opportunity to control a modern state. This was more unsettling than any psychiatric label. If Göring had been declared mentally ill, the world might have felt relief. Crimes could be explained as anomaly. Kelly's conclusion removed that comfort. He saw the human capacity to push tendencies common in many societies to extremes. In Göring, he saw a man facing death who spoke fluently about strategy, loyalty to the Führer, pride in the Luftwaffe, and role in building the regime, fully understanding accusations, yet showing no genuine remorse. He admitted tactical errors and defeats, but rarely questioned the legitimacy of the project he served. The mental machinery that justified deportations, murder, and total war remained intact across Kelly's table. Kelly compared this stability to exceptions like Robert Ley, whose disorganization was severe. Most defendants functioned with clarity, leaving no legal doubt. They knew what they had done and why, and could answer in court. Kelly drafted formal reports carefully, but without ambiguity. Göring was in good physical and mental condition for trial, understood charges, could cooperate with defense, and there was no psychiatric basis to declare him unfit. He wrote similarly for most others, supporting the premise that they were responsible individuals. Privately, Kelly understood the paradox. By proving they were not insane, he showed similar personalities could arise elsewhere. What he saw in the cells was not one monster, but a type that could thrive wherever society followed it. He tried to frame the warning positively, strengthen institutions, distrust absolute solutions, but he knew the message clashed with a human need to believe evil comes only from abnormal minds. Many preferred Gilbert's diagnosis because it separated Nazis from humanity. Kelly carried a darker truth. They were not insane, and precisely for that reason they were dangerous. When the tribunal opened, the Palace of Justice became more than legal space. It became a stage. Cameras, stenographers, diplomats, journalists, and observers gathered not only to decide fate of 22 men, but to establish an official narrative of responsibility for war and genocide. One man drew central attention, Hermann Göring. Prosecutors knew he was an experienced speaker, former number 2, comfortable asserting control in any room. Psychiatric reports confirmed he was not broken or confused, but intellectually sharp, narcissistic, aware of his situation, and determined to use the proceedings for narrative advantage. Kelly's evaluations mattered strategically, confirming Göring and others understood charges, could follow proceedings, and cooperate with counsel, meaning the tribunal would face a strong defendant capable of turning the dock into a podium. Allied prosecutors framed the trial around deliberate responsibility. War was planned and executed by conscious decisions, matching Kelly's portrait. When Göring testified, the courtroom leaned toward him. In direct examination, he displayed confidence, detailed memory, and dramatic skill, portraying himself as patriot and pragmatic statesman. Early testimony produced an uncomfortable impression that he was regaining aura, correcting mistakes, handling details, leaning on technicalities, speaking with fluency. Headlines appeared about his resurgence. The danger Kelly saw in prison, Göring's ability to dominate space, now played out on a world stage. The prosecution adjusted, returning again and again to documents, signed orders, minutes, deportation numbers, execution records, using evidence to strip performance. In the duel with Jackson, Göring sometimes controlled pace with long theatrical answers, but as evidence accumulated and other prosecutors joined, his shine cracked. Charisma remained, but concealment became harder, and speeches began to sound hollow. Kelly was no longer present during these courtroom scenes, transferred back to the United States, but followed transcripts and reports and saw confirmation of what he had learned. Göring remained brilliant, narcissistic, unwilling to admit moral guilt, seeking victory in narrative. His competence meant he could not hide behind illness. Psychiatry declared him fit, law established guilt, and the lesson remained. Danger resides not only in visible fanatics or madmen, but also in men who use words, charm, and apparent rationality to lead others toward catastrophe. On the night of October 15, 1946, the prison prepared for the execution ritual planned with precision. The next morning, 12 condemned prisoners, including Göring, were to be taken to the gallows erected in the gymnasium. Everything was designed to show international justice carried out coldly and publicly, with no errors. Colonel Andrus was obsessed with preventing suicide, having already faced self-inflicted deaths, and knowing another would damage the trials. Surveillance was constant, lights stayed on, searches were frequent, suspicious objects removed. In theory, hiding cyanide was impossible. Göring knew the system, living under it for more than a year, watched night and day, inspected constantly, detoxed, and having seen others collapse, yet he maintained discipline. His sentence was final, guilt on all charges, request to be shot as soldier rejected, and he would die hanged, which he considered humiliating. In the final days, routine filled with farewell letters, chaplain visits, limited meetings. Göring wrote to his wife Emmy and daughter Edda, discussed estate details, spoke with Protestant pastor Henry Gericke, and made dark jokes. Nothing suggested panic. Guards reported the execution night seemed calm. Göring lay down, read, reclined. A soldier watched through the peephole. Nothing seemed unusual until late at night, when the prisoner's body suddenly moved violently. Guards entered and found him convulsing, cyanide odor in the air, and a small metal container associated with the capsule appearing in the cell. Doctors confirmed death minutes later. Chaos followed. The most watched prisoner had bypassed controls at the last moment, denying the Allies the image planned to close the trial, Göring hanging as final symbol. Immediately the mystery began. How did he obtain poison? Theories circulated, one claiming he hid it since capture inside a personal object later returned, another suggesting an American soldier helped him after being seduced by charisma, and decades later, Herbert Stivers claimed he passed him a pill hidden in a pen, believing it harmless. None became fully confirmed. What was certain was the outcome. Göring avoided the gallows he considered undignified, disrupted the final act of the Allied justice ritual, and left Andrus under a shadow. The death was not only a security failure, but symbolic sabotage of the victor's closing script. From the United States, Kelly received the news with surprise and confirmation. To outsiders, it could look like desperation, but to Kelly, it fit too perfectly with Göring's psychology to be reduced to panic. It was control. It was the final move of a man who refused to let others write his ending. Kelly interpreted the suicide not as romantic gesture or military dignity, but as a deliberate refusal to become the object of Allied choreography. Swallowing cyanide in the cell was Göring's way of asserting, "I still decide." He avoided public humiliation, but more importantly, he avoided surrendering the narrative entirely. Even in death, he left a puzzle: how the poison arrived, who helped, how surveillance failed, shifting attention toward the guards and away from the condemned. For Kelly, that was crucial. The suicide did not reveal a broken man. It revealed the same high intelligence, narcissism, obsession with legacy, and refusal to accept passive victimhood that had defined Göring throughout captivity. The cyanide capsule became an ironic symbol, proof strict systems can be defeated by determined individuals, and a reminder that the drive to dominate can remain intact to the end. While other condemned were taken to the gallows and later cremated, Göring's corpse became a focus of photographs, reports, and speculation. Formal justice was frustrated in form, not in substance. He was dead, but not as planned. And Kelly, the psychiatrist who had tried to understand his mind, recognized that even in absolute defeat, Göring found a way to decide how and when the curtain fell.